So, can I have attention please? So, I think we are getting little late. We have to start the next session, which is quite interesting, and this is the first session of our opening day, and the session is exploring a deeper understanding of life. So, there are two speakers, very interesting talks they are presenting. First one, epistemic integrity and compatibility in understanding life and its purpose, a Gaudiya Vaishnava perspective on science and Shastra by Sripad Bhakti Kamal Tyagi Maharaj from Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Mutt, and he is a Tridandi Sannyasi and a disciple of Srila Bhakti Sundar Govindadev Goswami Maharaj, the President Sevaite Acharya of Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Mutt, and also sannyas from Srila Bhakti Nirmal Acharya Goswami Maharaj. He is an editor of several books of Gaudiya philosophy, and he extensively travels all over the world for presenting the message of the Acharyas of Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Mutt and Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. He is a proficient in Sanskrit and Bengali language, and he is from California. So we request Sripad Tyagi Maharaj to speak first, and there is another interesting talk we have, that is by Professor V. Srinivas Chakravarti, and he is a faculty in the Department of Biotechnology at IIT Madras who works on computational neuroscience, and he will be presenting a very interesting talk on approaches to the consciousness question in neuroscience. So I request the speakers to limit their presentation to half an hour so that we have sufficient time for discussion. Thank you very much.
Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashitam rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram Shri Guru Gaura Gandharva Govindam Green Ganai Saha Bande Prasadato Yesham Sarvaramba Shubhankara Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Garadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. As is customary in my tradition, we always begin with the Mangala Charan. I think you're all familiar with that. And a brief background, apart from what Sripad Shantamarj mentioned, was that I studied environmental studies at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And after completing my bachelor's degree, did nothing more with science and have since been completely absorbed in theological studies. So science is not my field. I don't pretend or claim to be able to represent it in any type of depth. But the intersection of Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, which has its footing in Vedanta as well as Vedic Shastra in general, and scientific study in a philosophical sense is what I will speak to, and how those things relate to both the ongoing development of science as a field as well as popular discourse and understanding of those things in our society. So as you know, time is short. I'll be brisk, so stay with me, but if I'm going too fast, please feel free to let me know to slow down. So I'll start with wrong button. I'll start with definitions. And as all of you are aware, the word science, before we enter into its popular, prominent meaning, in an original linguistic sense, means knowledge as distinguished from ignorance or misunderstanding, or a systemized body of knowledge as an object of study. So this is a broad notion of what science is, but according to the dictionary, we have a more common specific meaning as knowledge or a system of knowledge governing general truths or the operation of general laws as obtained and tested through the scientific method. So when I say science, I will be speaking about that type of science, specifically the kind that comes through the scientific method, not a broader notion of science which could pertain to other types of knowledge. And specifically when we talk about such science regarding the scientific method, we mean such knowledge as a system concerned with the physical world and its phenomena. So in other words, not things that pertain to the supernatural, to spirituality, to divinity, to matters of faith and subjectivity, But when I say science, within this context, I'm talking about things that pertain to the naturalistic worldview and are popularly known as science and studied at institutes like the one we're in today. Clear? Definitely. Now, when we talk about Shastra, what are we talking about? Linguistically, the term Shastra comes from the Sanskrit dhatu shas, which means to regulate, to instruct, to command or govern something. And tra, as a suffix, indicates something that functions as an instrument or a mechanism. So Shastra is a means by which instruction is given, or a means by which something is done. So a Shastra can be just a specific command, or it can be a body or compilation of commands that produce or are a mechanism by which a particular action is either caused to be performed by another or caused by an individual. So, more broadly, Shastra is a teaching or an instrument of teaching, and specifically, when I'm going to talk about Shastra from this moment on, it refers to texts, specifically those that are considered sacred and deal with things of supernatural origin and authority. So although in traditional discourse the term Shastra also has been a term which refers to texts, some of which did deal with naturalistic worldview within Vedic knowledge, I'm not referring to those Shastras right now. I'm referring to specifically Shastras that describe divinity, God, spirituality, what conventionally in the Western world is called religious texts. But I don't want to speak on behalf of other traditions. I'm speaking about the specific understanding of Shastra in the tradition that I study, and that's it, because I don't want to speak about anything that I'm not qualified to speak about. Clear? So I'm going to present an analysis of these two scopes of knowledge based on a method of analyzing worldviews as well as texts, which comes from the Purvamimamsaka Darshan in traditional Indian philosophy, known as the Anubandha Chatushtay, and is something that you'll find in many Vedantic texts, and other ways by which a subject is systematically organized into a way that is memorable and understandable. So these four components that form this aspect of how texts and their meaning were developed in Purvamimamsaka is as follows. The Vishai, Prayojan, Adhikari, and Sambandha, or the subject of the field, the objective of the study, the adherent, in other words, the people who involve themselves in the engagement in that field, and the relation means how does that Adhikari, or that person involved in the study, achieve the objective within the field. Clear, right? So, when we speak of Shastra, and when we speak of science, in the way that we've just defined, we can speak first very broadly and say that they have the same subject. They both speak about what in Shastra is called tattva, and what a scientist, I hope, would agree to as reality, or the world. Neither a follower of Shastra nor a scientist would volunteer and say, yes, I'd like to speak about something fictitious, I'd like to speak about nonsense, I'd like to speak about something that has no meaning. Everybody wants something that's real, everyone wants something that has practical value. So in a broad sense, science and Shastra have the same subject, they both want to be concerned with what is real. Now what is reality? That's a subject for further discussion. Second, we have similarity in their objectives. We can say that science and Shastra share the objectives of developing true and meaningful knowledge, of reducing suffering in people's lives, and of increasing the quality of people's life. A scientist and their field of study make relative contributions to society, just as those who follow traditional spiritual traditions do. So they have the same subject and the same goal. And broadly speaking, they also have the same people involved in them. They have people who want knowledge of reality, who want to benefit one and all, and require, because the term adhikari not only means people who engage in it, but those who are properly qualified to engage in it, they both require people who prove themselves proficient in their discipline. So just as there is discussion of pseudoscience, or there is discussion of the manipulation of science, which is subjects we'll get into soon. There is also people who misrepresent religion, who utilize religion for the sake of politics, and so on and so forth. So each field, just like every other field of human knowledge, suffers from people who misappropriate it for other purposes. So when we speak of a proper adhikari, or a proper person involved in another field, it means someone who's actually doing the subject of study as they're meant to be doing it. Then, where does the dissimilarity begin? Because, generally speaking, science and religion are considered separate fields of knowledge, so the primary focus, the primary point of departure, comes when we come to what is classically called sambandha, or more specifically, when it comes to methodology. How is it that reality is known? How is it that this objective of reducing suffering, of increasing the quality of life, how is it that that is achieved? That is the specific point where the two fields separate. So that brings us directly to the subject of epistemology, discussion of how knowledge is gathered. How do we know what we know? So the fundamentals of epistemology, at least within classical Indian darshan, are as follows. To acquire knowledge, there must be a knower, there must be a means of acquiring knowledge, and there must be an object that is going to be known. And when the means of knowledge functions properly, then the knower can acquire valid knowledge. So the key element in discussion of epistemology and in our discussion today is praman, the means by which valid knowledge is acquired. So, vichar, or what is known as the inquiry into truth, or the search for knowledge and understanding, is defined classically in Sanskrit literature as trying to know tattva, or trying to ascertain the nature of reality, but specifically as examination of the nature of an uncertain object by a valid means of acquiring certain knowledge. Or in other words, only when the appropriate means of acquiring knowledge is applied will we acquire meaningful knowledge. So the critical element in any subject of inquiry is properly utilizing the means by which the subject that you're seeking to know can be known. So, what are these means of knowledge? Then within the classical darshans of Indian philosophy, upon which the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition has built their system of epistemology, three pramanas are a principle. And when I speak of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, for anyone who's familiar with it, I speak specifically of the teachings of Srila Jiva Goswami, who was the most influential and prolific philosopher within the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition to date. He lived about and wrote prolifically about 450 years ago in Vrindavan. And his works, in particular his magnum opus known as the Shat Sandarbha, or his 6 compendiums on the meaning of Srimad Bhagavatam, as well, and more broadly the meaning of Vedic Shastra as a totality, form the theological basis of Gaudiya Vaishnava thought and practice up into the present day. So he has drawing predominant, he prior to coming to Vrindavan and presenting Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, he went to Varanasi and he studied all the 6 darshans as well as Advaita Vedanta with scholars and experts of those traditions there, and then studied Gaudiya Vaishnava teachings from his uncle and the then chief representatives of the tradition, Rupa and Sanatana Goswamis, and then combined all those elements to produce this comprehensive philosophical basis for Gaudiya Vaishnava practice. So what I will present of the pramanas is more or less the cream of Indian darshanic discourse as he distilled it in some of his works on the subject known as the Tattva Sandarbha, and a commentary he wrote on his own Tattva Sandarbha and called the Sarva Samvadani. So he discusses at length 10 types of pramanas and gives them in a different hierarchy and how they function, but broadly throughout all the systems of darshan, 3 types of praman are widely recognized. These are known as pratyaksha, anuman, and shabda. So what I'm going to present now is how these 3 pramanas function within both the spiritual culture guided by Shastra, as well as science in the technical sense of inquiry into the natural world using the scientific method. But, so first I'll come to pratyaksha. But for most of this presentation, I'm going to parallel science with Shastra back and forth, but I'm skipping right now a scientific discussion of how pratyaksha works because I'm unqualified to present that. I can only present you the theological view based on the Sandarbhas. So this is a broad subject which you could give a whole entire presentation on, but in a nutshell, he breaks down how perception works into an interaction between these core elements. We have tattva, reality, or the world, or existence, whatever it may be, and that is recognized by sense, or is composed of sense objects. And this ties in the notion of, is the world or the reality that we're perceiving a manifestation of our own self, and is it dreamlike, or is it ultimately unreal, or is it factually real and something that's being perceived? That's a broad subject which goes to the core of Vedantic philosophy. And the Gaudiya Vaishnava verdict is that the world is real. The world is not ultimately only a product of an individual's perception or a product of illusion. It is a factually existent thing. And how that is proved at great depth, but that's beyond the scope of our discussion today. So this reality, which is real, is qualified within the context of epistemology as simply a collection of objects perceived by senses. And to perceive those objects, senses are used. Senses relay data to the mind. The intellect, or what's called the buddhi, then collects that data and moves to the chitta, which we don't have such a good word for this in English, something like the subconscious, some sort of memory bank, subconscious memory bank of stored data or impressions from past experience. And when a particular signal is drawn through perception into the mind, and then the intellect grabs that signal and starts scanning the whole data bank in the chitta, looking for a match, so to speak. A little bit like if you run a text search on your computer or on Google, Google picks up whatever text you write, and then it looks through all the cataloged data it has, and when these letters match those letters, you get a match, and it says this is this. So we have a particular set of what are called samskaras, or these prior subtle impressions produced by past experience within our subconscious, and when our present perception matches a previous impression, we say, this is a microphone, this is a computer, this is my friend, this is a tree, or whatever it is that we perceive. And we experience what is called, in English, conveniently, recognition, or we reconceive, or we recognize that thing that already was experienced. So the word is quite convenient because it leads us to the conclusion that comes from this method, that you can't actually perceive something that you don't already have some impression or a thing stored within you to recognize. And then building upon that whole experience is enabled by a faculty known as the ahankar, or the sense of self, or the self that is having the perception within the mind of that data match between the signal and the previous impression. And that ahankar, or that sense of I that we experience, is a product of, or enabled by, the actual self, which according to Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy is known as the jiva, or the atma, or the jivatma, and is a non-material, non-perceivable entity. It will never be, and has never been, perceived by the naturalistic worldview, but is known only through Shastra. And that self has the capacity for self-awareness, as well as awareness of things other than itself, when it's provided with the necessary tools, namely, all of the above. So when that jivatma is embodied and has an ego, a subconscious, an intellect, a mind, senses, and sense objects, it can experience both a sense of self as well as a world around it. And that entire cycle and method of experience is enabled by this supreme soul, what loosely and what parallels in Western tradition you might call God, but what does not qualify as the supreme being within Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, is known as the Paramatma, or the Atma of all Atmas, this one ultimate entity in reality that sustains the existence of all else. Okay, in a nutshell, this is perception, or pratyaksha praman within Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy. And specifically, the two most significant elements of this process I already sort of covered are what is called nirvikalpa pratyaksha or savikalpa pratyaksha, where initially there is an unidentified or an indeterminate perception, and then there is this subtle process within the self by which that indeterminate signal is then formulated into a determinate perception. So I already explained these points. Now, all such perception is subject to various defects, or in other words, is not necessarily accurate. So I won't go into a lot of detail in these are discussed classically, but the typical ways that such perceptions can be wrong are classified as misidentification, inattention, deceit, or sensory incapacity. So, examples. Perhaps you've had the experience of mistaking a rope for a snake, or mistaking a scarecrow for a person, or a dead tree for a person, or a child could look at the moon and look up at the moon and say, the moon's about the same size as my hand. These sort of aberrations, or things that we know or can, by broader sense of knowledge, understand are not true, but at that moment of perception, they appear to be. So such mistaken or misidentification of things can be produced by various causes. Let me pull those up for you. Pardon me. It is said that if we mistake a rope for a snake, then that might often happen if I just recently saw a snake. Or if you just recently had a sort of frightening experience, then when something that resembles that experience happens again, it triggers that sense of experience, even though that's not directly what you're perceiving. Under insufficient conditions for the instruments by which we perceive, we may not perceive things accurately, such as we might at dusk mistake a tree for a person. If we lack sufficient information about something, we may misidentify it, just as a child might not understand that the sun is no bigger than its hand. And if we have a disease or something that is altering our capacity to perceive things accurately, we won't perceive them properly, just as someone with jaundice will see white things to be yellow and taste sweets to be bitter. So this can literally take place, or it can produce doubt. Okay, this is the first type of flaw in perception, known as Brahm. Second, we may perceive something and yet not perceive it. Just as I'm talking right now, you can also hear the sound of this air conditioner. But you're not hearing the sound of the air conditioner because you're paying attention to the sound of my voice, unless you're asleep. In which case, you're not hearing my voice. But yet, the sound is still going in your ears. So the point is, you only perceive something that you pay attention to, so it's not that necessarily everything that your senses pick up produces or leads to valid knowledge of what's happening. And not only is inattention, or there can also be a misidentification due to a lack of close focus. And I had this experience once. I was at a temple, and I was walking out behind the temple, and it was an area where many of the flowers that are offered are dumped in a pile. Many marigolds that were yellow and orange. And as I looked, for a second, I saw a fire burning at the base of a tree, and I felt this moment of, oh my gosh, there's a fire. And then I turned to another monk who I was walking with, and we both looked at each other, it's a fire! And we both saw fire. And then we thought, wait a minute. And we both looked back, and then we both had the simultaneous experience of going, that's just a bunch of flowers, that's not fire at all. And we both had the same illusion at the exact same time, independent of each other, and shared this experience of being illusioned, and then realizing we're an illusion, and then laughing about how that happens. So, that's clear. Third, we can have a misunderstanding of things when we are not provided with information properly. So, when we're learning or when we're perceiving things, various types of bias or various types of deception may take place. So a teacher may withhold information from a student for whatever cause that person may have. Sorry, I need to advance the slide here. Information may be misrepresented intentionally due to various other factors. Or misinformation may be withheld, or information may be presented with bias. So you can all read all of these things. I won't spend so much time on this because this is a lot of what we'll get into towards the end. And lastly, the senses that we have, or the capacity that we have to perceive the world around us, is very limited. Such as, the eye. It can only perceive things at a certain range, at a certain degree of brightness, and thus it's known that we only perceive a limited amount of the light that exists in our midst. So the tattva, or the reality that's in our midst, is only being slightly perceived due to the limited capacity of our senses. A bit like the elephant analogy that Shantaji mentioned earlier. And this applies obviously not only to the eye, but to all of the physical senses as well as the mind. So, combining all of these potential flaws together, we come to the limitations of pratyaksha praman. So, arguably, it is said that using this type of sensory perception, it is problematic at least, and arguably impossible, to acquire knowledge of the environment around us that is 100% free from error. And if the data that we're collecting can never be, or is arguably never, completely accurate, then can any conclusion or generalization about the laws that are producing that data ever be equally inerrant? No. However, does that mean that no such knowledge produced by pratyaksha praman has any utility? Not at all. It has immense utility. It has immense practicality. We would die without it. It's the fabric of our very life. So I'm not here to try to, make an argument from absurdity about the value of perception, but just to say that there's a distinction between reality and viability, or reality and utility. And this is very important to understand the relationship of Shastra and science. Okay, then, second, we have inference, what is classically known as anuman, or drawing conclusions, and specifically the word anu means something that comes after, and the word man means to form a notion or concept. So literally, the idea comes from the idea of once you've collected data, or once you've had perceptions, then after that, or upon that, you draw conclusions. You form concepts and ideas about them. So, anuman is specifically defined as a means by which we can know things that we cannot directly perceive. So, the classical example of how this works is the analogy of the fire on the mountain, where we have knowledge. The key element in inference is this middle point, what's called the udaharan, or the precedent, where we have had a past experience, that when we saw fire, we saw that the fire produced smoke. So, based on that past perception, in the future, when we then perceive not fire, but we perceive smoke, we see a reason for a proposition that there is fire because there is smoke. And we confirm that yes, this reason is present, and this reason has a precedent. Therefore, we will conclude there is fire on the mountain even though we have not seen it directly. Very simple. Now, of course, I'll get to that in a second. So, types of inference are discussed in extreme detail in Nyaya Darshan, and I'm not a logician. I can only give you a very simplistic analogy of Nyaya, but classically there are three categories of inference. And I chose this particular overview of inference because it relates to the discussion of science. So these are known as inference from cause to effect, such as seeing a cloud and inferring that it will rain, inferring in the opposite direction from effect to cause, seeing a river rising and inferring that it has already rained, and third, inference from observations, So if we see that all animals that have horns also have tails, and in the distance, maybe you were here today, this morning I went out, I saw a few animals with horns to my surprise, so there's the deer and antelope, and if you see it as a distance, you might say, oh, I see horns, therefore I know that animal has a tail, even if I can't see the tail, based on this type of reasoning. So these are all extremely practical things that we do in our life. They're how we make decisions, how we follow directions, how we experience human life in a conventional sense. But such inference also has its limitation in producing actual valid knowledge of reality. Because Anuman is entirely built upon pratyaksha. So any inference that we may draw is subject to all the flaws that pratyaksha is subject to. And in addition, there are many invalid ways by which conclusions are drawn. In other words, the discussion of fallacies and all forms of false logic. So it's beyond the scope of this discussion to go into an extended discussion of logical fallacies. I'm sure you're well aware of the subject. So third, we have this third principal way by which knowledge is gathered, what is called shabda, or testimony. So testimony is specifically defined by most philosophers as aptavakya, or a statement from a source which is trustworthy or reliable. And how is that defined? That's defined as someone who speaks in a way that properly represents the reality, or conveys the tattva. And by communicating such knowledge, it is implied that pratyaksha and anuman have already taken place on the part of the speaker. They've acquired knowledge by those means, and now they're conveying that knowledge, that's the fruit of those other means of knowledge, to us through this separate means known as testimony. This is a critical point in the hierarchy of epistemology, that shabda is also built upon the other means of knowing. So classical examples of this are a person is walking in an unknown area and a local says to them, "Did you know that in this cave there are many gems?" A person walking by who has no experience of the area, who cannot see in the cave, has no way of knowing on their own what's inside the cave. They wouldn't necessarily by any inference conclude that anything is there, and by their own perception they can't see it, but yet they know it, because someone who does have that knowledge communicated it to them. In other words, shabda is a means that conveys knowledge by the power of language and thought itself. It doesn't require particular perception or inference on the part of the person. I don't need to apply logic to get knowledge through shabda. I just get it automatically. It's like a direct download, just based on the meaning of the words and my previous understanding of language. And shabda is actually the means by which we know the vast majority of what we know. As a child, we're taught language by our friends and family, and through language we come to know so many other things. And the vast amount of the conclusions and opinions that we hold about the world around us are not things that we ourselves have directly perceived, but things that we've heard others have perceived, and which we've come to know and which we accept on that basis. So shabda is the very fabric of human knowledge, communication, and culture. Without it, it wouldn't be an experiment that would be humane to conduct, but in the past it has been seen that if you take human beings and you isolate them completely, you don't teach them language, you don't culture them in any way, they live a miserable life and they never come to discover the wheel or invent electricity or any of these similar things within their own short life. So, shabda in particular is key to the field of science and definitely key to the culture of spirituality, because it is only by means of shabda praman that you can form any type of collaborative field of knowledge. It's not that Einstein discovered or Newton discovered or anyone discovered everything, but it is the ability of scientists or the ability of spiritualists to learn from the experience of others and then formulate and develop collective knowledge that is the means by which progress takes place. So I bring up all of this I'll say something more about shabda before I go to the role of shabda within science. So this other distinguishing features of Shabda Praman are as follows, that Shabda can also teach us things that are not something that we would necessarily acquire from our own pratyaksha and anuman. So the classical example of this is a child who's taken to, like, let's say a child from South India who's taken to the mountains in the winter and it perceives ice for the first time in their life. So a child perceiving ice for the first time in their life would not necessarily know and would not necessarily infer that this very hard thing called ice could melt into water. Based on the limited knowledge and experience they have, they don't know that. But if they're told by their parents, you know what that is? That's actually water. Then they know that. And they can then confirm that by their own experience by lighting a fire. But it's not something that they would know on their own. So we can come to know something that we ourselves wouldn't infer and wouldn't know otherwise. More specifically, that can occur even with things that are counterintuitive. Just as, normally speaking, metal cuts stone and stone cannot cut metal. But if we're told there's a special type of stone known as diamond, which is so hard it can even cut metal, then we come to know this thing that we would otherwise never infer. Furthermore, Shabda has the ability to correct flawed perception and flawed reasoning. So the classical examples of these are that there's a teacher and there are 9 students in a room and he's teaching epistemology or perhaps something else, and he asks one of the students, how many people are in this room? And the student looks around and says, well, there's 9 people in the room. And the teacher says, no, you're the 10th. And the student absent-mindedly looked around, counted the amount of people he saw and said there's 9 and forgot to count himself. And just immediately when the teacher says, you're the 10th, he understands, I forgot to count myself, and his flawed conclusion is corrected. Similarly, the analogy is given that there's a person who has an extremely valuable jewel and is about to depart for travel and is packing their things and is extremely concerned that they don't lose the jewel. So then they're looking around, where is the jewel, where is the jewel? And they come to their friend, what happened to my jewel? And the friend says, you're wearing the jewel. And they're so worried about the jewel that they forgot it's right around them. So it's not something that they couldn't have known or something that they might not have even seen, but yet only by hearing this source of testimony from outside of their own mind do they come to know what that is. And lastly, there are things we can know by Shabda that we can never know by our own perception or inference, such as a mother telling her child, I'm your mother and he's your father. Nowadays, of course, there are blood testing and all of these things, but in classical epistemology, this is the example. You don't remember what happened when you're born, you don't know who your father was, because you didn't even exist when the conception took place. Anyway, this is all common sense. I'm going at appropriate speed, right? This is easy to follow. What's that?
You have to conclude in 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Oh my gosh. So, limitations of testimony are that all such Shabda is itself based on Anuman and Pratyaksha, and thus subject to all the flaws that those are, and furthermore, is not necessarily reliable due to the types of bias that anyone communicating knowledge to someone else can have. Okay, so these 3 forms of gathering knowledge function equally within science as well as within spirituality, religion, what I'm calling adherence to Shastra. So I won't go into any extended discussion of the scientific method. You're all scientists and know that better than me. But as you know, it involves all of these elements in a cycle. And I just put here some examples of how these 3 essential types of gathering knowledge function at each stage in the scientific method. So, in other words, by a combination of an individual scientist's perception, the inference that he draws upon that, as well as his collection of information based on the inference and perception of other sciences, he conducts scientific inquiry as well as contributes to the collaborative body of scientific knowledge. Now, within all such gathering of knowledge through the scientific method, you have certain assumptions or certain beliefs that enable scientific inquiry to occur. Now, this is a critical point to prove that science is not philosophically speaking, inherently objective, because it makes the following assumptions. I have very little time, so I won't go into all of them, but it assumes that there is an objective reality that is shared by rational observers, that it's governed by laws, that these laws function in an invariably consistent and uniform manner, and that such study of science can be conducted without bias. I don't have time to go into them, but many of these essential philosophical assumptions to the naturalistic worldview have flaws. So already in the discussion today, the problem of induction, which was in particular highlighted in Western thought by David Hume, was brought up with this example of the balls, the black ball and the white ball, or I think Bertrand Russell, he gave it as an analogy where he said, if a chicken lives in a shack and every day for 100 days its master comes and feeds it nice food every day, then the chicken will say to its other chicken, our master is just so nice. And then on the 101st day, that master comes and chops off his head. So you can see something 100 times. You can repeat an experiment 100 times, but that doesn't necessarily prove that at a further degree of study that some factor outside of your present understanding can act. So this is the problem of induction, which relegates all scientific generalization about the nature of the world to a probability as opposed to a conclusive form of knowledge or reality. Second of all, the problem of bias, that when people conduct science, scientific inquiry, they have a motive. They want to contribute to society, they want to produce knowledge, and they may seek a certain degree of recognition for that, or they may seek certain types of confirmation to the existing assumptions that they've already made. I'm sure you're well aware of things like confirmation bias and other sorts of cognitive biases that can shape the way we think. I don't have time for more of that, as well as the point of demarcation between science and non-science, and where the term science is a popular word which carries epistemological weight in society is defined and not defined. Now, similarly, these three types of praman, they function within the culture of Shastra. I don't have time for those, but there are similarly fundamental assumptions in any type of cultivation of revealed religion, such as a pre-assumption that a supernatural reality is real, that supernatural reality can self-manifest itself, that Shastra, or whatever particular method you prefer, is a self-manifestation of that supernatural reality itself, and is an aptavakya, or an inerrant source of knowledge. And moreover, specifically within Vedic discourse and Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, Shabda or Shastra is not only regarded as a source of proper knowledge about the world, it's actually regarded as the very source of the world itself. And it's believed that the Shastra itself describes like a blueprint or a code the way the world is manifest, and the entire world is manifest from that code. So the Shastra therefore cannot be wrong in its description of the nature of the world, because the world itself is a description of the Shastra. This is the degree of faith that those who follow Shastra have. Now, this is more in Gaudiya Vaishnava epistemology. I'm not speaking specifically about Krishna, our worshipable deity, or the details of our faith, but philosophically speaking, when I'm just drawing a contrast between the natural and the supernatural, but specifically Jiva Goswami highlights these particular elements as defining characteristics of the absolute reality. So there are similarly, quote-unquote, problems in the epistemology of Shastra. You have to have faith in it straight up from the front. Second of all, you may have bias as to why you have faith in it. You might just be conforming to your culture. You might be afraid to defy your father. You might be seeking social recognition for being a good person according to the customs that you live in. And you might have already invested in it for a certain number of years in your life and then fall into the sunk cost fallacy and not want to change the way you think, because you think, I've already spent so much time on this already, I don't want to lose out on what I've gotten, so I'll just stick it out. And so many other types of cognitive bias, they also play in the minds of religionists or pseudo-religionists. So, seeing that they have these same methods of gathering knowledge and are subject to many of the same biases, where is it that science and Shastra really diverge apart from the application of method? Then this is the critical work of Jiva Goswami, which really vividly breaks down the distinction between these two things. He uses these terms, Avaidusha Pratyaksha and Vaidusha Pratyaksha, as well as Purusheya Shabda and Apurusheya Shabda, the second of which are broadly used terms, to say that the essence of scientific perception or knowledge is based on perception of the natural world using the senses, and that the basis of supernatural perception is itself the fruit of Shastra. Or in other words, that it produces Shastra, that Shastra is itself the product of supernatural perception, and that supernatural perception encoded in Shastra can then convey knowledge of supernatural reality to another. Just as a scientist conducts an experiment, he produces a study, he communicates the study to another, and someone else acquires knowledge of the natural world that they themselves never saw. So, then, although, broadly speaking, science and Shastra shared the same objective, the same subject, and the same group of followers, once we confine and we specify this type of epistemology, then we get a different subject. Science is pertaining to the natural world, Shastra pertaining to the supernatural. Now, of course, Shastra also discusses society and well-being in human life, but I'm confining the discussion right now to the supernatural, one, because that's the ultimate objective of Gaudiya Vaishnava practice, and two, because it simplifies things for the purpose of our contrasting right now. Second of all, the notion of a quality of life or reduction of suffering is also qualified by its scope. So science seeks to produce an increase in the quality of life within the context of the natural world, whereas this culture of Shastra is focused on the well-being of people in the context of the supernatural, which is not entirely synonymous with well-being in the naturalistic sense. So, people who identify with one epistemology or another will be those who take up one method of inquiry or the opposite. So what is required for both of these things to function and contribute their relative fruits to society? First of all is integrity. That both have to be conducted properly according to their epistemological compasses. So, where does that go wrong? That goes wrong when there is a lack of epistemological rigor. So, to blindly deny valid knowledge acquired by inappropriate means, which is to say that a scientist has no scope to deny the revelation given in a Shastra based on his knowledge of the naturalistic world, nor does an adherent of Shastra have any business denying the collection of knowledge conducted by scientists using the scientific method. So where this typically comes up is fanaticism, where, let's say, a religionist has a blind belief, especially in a shallow interpretation of their own religious text, and then sees scientific knowledge coming out with descriptions of the world that contradict that, and they freak out, for lack of a better word, and they just do whatever they can to try to falsify these claims that challenge their superficial interpretation of their own text. And then, the other response to this cognitive tension is to muddle the two, and to say that what these people are coming to know through naturalistic science and what these people are coming to know through Shastra, look at this, they actually match, and this term is this term and that term is that term, when they're actually speaking about two very different things. For example, in the context of today's conference, life. Life in the context of biology and life defined as an eternal Atma are two completely different things. We cannot conflate the two concepts. Right? Life as a Jivatma, defined in Shastra, is an imperceptible spiritual entity that can, has, and never will be perceived by any naturalistic method, and is presumed through deduction of Shastric principles to be the cause by which life in the observable or scientific biological sense is perceived. But to conflate the two and say that what we come to know through naturalistic science about life gives us more light or more information about what only Shastra can tell us about the jiva, this is to muddle the two which produces what? It produces either pseudoscience or it produces improperly grounded spirituality, which is not going to produce the desired spiritual result. Okay, almost done. So what the big thing that comes up in these two things is when there are apparent contradictions. So when, let's say, the story of Noah's Ark or the story of the lotus from Brahma's navel that people hear in their respective texts contrasts with the theory of evolution or the timeline of the world given by various scientific views, people don't know what to do with themselves. So, struggling with that tension, they either blindly just attribute bias to any scientific study or any religious belief that is contrary to what they prefer, or they try to say that what is ultimately subjective and described in Shastra must necessarily be interpreted as an objective reality and confirmed by objective observers. In most cases, I can't speak for other traditions, but specifically in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, according to the hermeneutics of how we understand Shastra, this is completely unfounded. That's a lovely subject, but we definitely don't have time for that. And lastly, as a result of all such bias, to pit the two against each other is a disservice to them both. So how can, in the midst of such challenges, there be some form of compatibility? Then there first of all needs to be mutual respect for the relative contribution that each can make to human life. Second of all, it needs to be understood that it's not difficult for them to both coexist. We observe that people can conduct naturalistic science rigorously and appropriately, and at the same time, as a person, as an individual, also have faith in Shastra and an aspiration for an experience within the supernatural world that Shastra describes. These two things can coexist in a person, they can coexist in an institution, such as a university, as well as in a community. So the wild goose chase is when we want to try to confirm one with the other. It's not going to happen, right? So the supernatural will never be known by the conventional means of pratyaksha, anuman, and shabda. We can never prove or falsify the existence of God, of the living entity, or anything else using those means. So to claim or to seek to falsify what is taught in one by means of the other only produces confusion for the uneducated. And only, we can say, would annoy the educated, but the really educated are above being annoyed, so they just tolerate it and seek to educate those who do so. Okay. Now, how can understanding, I'm really close to being done, I'm sorry for going over, progressive collaboration be developed? Then you're probably familiar with what's known as the Mertonian norms, or I heard someone also mention Karl Popper earlier today, so he gave this doctrine of falsifiability. Anything that's genuinely science has to be done in a way that it can be falsified, and the people conducting the science have to be happy when their results are falsified. Our professor earlier was describing how he chose a difficult test to confirm his theory rather than just looking for something easy to bolster his own thoughts. This is a good example of rigorous skepticism, as well as other ethics that involve in conducting proper natural science. And lastly, I'll say that at the same time, to completely separate the two worlds of discourse also seems superficial, and that it's not impossible, given proper epistemological rigor on the part of individuals, that statements made in various shastras could be used to inform scientific inquiry, scientific prediction. We don't want to outlaw that. That's admissible, and that could arguably, I could say in my personal opinion, would be something progressive, but that needs to be labeled as such and done in a confessional manner, and not conflated with science that's done apart from any intention to do that. In other words, just as in theology, and even in an academic institution, if you want to do a PhD on Vaishnavism or whatever, you also have to say confessionally whether you believe in this or not. So similarly, to present something as science when it's actually motivated by religious dogma, and then win the respect of the public or corner a market within scientific discourse for your religious dogma is not a service to the scientific community, nor is it really a service to your own faith. At least I can speak about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, saying that really doesn't help people understand what Gaudiya Vaishnavism actually is. But at the same time, to say that we can conduct science rigorously, skeptically, and yet not exclude different sources of inspiration for how inquiry and prediction is made, because arguably even atheistic scientists aren't free from various forms of religious discourse shaping the way that, and narratives they have about the world. And moreover, historically, many of the persons who've made great advancements in science were also people who themselves were religious, such as Roger Bacon, who some recognize as the person who first developed the scientific method. And lastly, okay, I'm too much done. So this is more about collaboration, and as a result of these things, you'll get proper, progressive, and reliable scientific research, and you'll have the chance to be sincere and have a fulfilling experience of following Shastra. Sorry I went too long.
Good afternoon. I think in spirituality, right, generally people live in a state of higher consciousness, right, where time and space don't exist. But I live in a mundane condition where time and space completely exists, right? I'm conscious of it, I will measure it very precisely, so I'll try to stick to the time as much as possible. So first of all, I would like to thank Professor L.S. Ganesh to give me the opportunity to talk about consciousness and neuroscience in this forum. So I accepted, it's a bit daunting to accept to talk in a forum like this because I'm not a philosopher, I'm a scientist, and so also my area is computational neuroscience, which has got to do with modeling brain function using mathematical models. So whereas consciousness is not my area of research, but I'm very interested in the topic, so I'll share some elementary things as they're going on in neuroscience. So if they're wrong or too trivial, please forgive me. So first of all, addressing a problem like consciousness from a scientific point of view is quite daunting. It's fraught with some fundamental difficulties compared to approaching this question from spirituality, or I don't know what is the correct word for that. Is that first of all, science has two major pillars, empiricism and objectivism. In empiricism, you insist on experiment and experience. In objectivism, you make sure you insist on making the phenomenon completely objective. So don't involve anything subjective. Don't involve anything about your thoughts and feelings and things like that. So when you're looking at consciousness, first principle is okay, because in empiricism you insist on experience, so that is okay, because in spirituality, right, a person can go into higher states and then give a commentary on what that person is feeling. But objectivism was a very difficult problem for consciousness, because consciousness by its very nature is both objective and subjective, right? It seems both of them seem to be two facets of consciousness. So with that restriction, how do you do research on consciousness? So let us look at some very elementary facts. So currently, the way neuroscience works is anything that you can measure, observe, right, using instruments or directly, there's a lot of data about that. So we have a lot of data about how brain works, right, and right from single neuron recordings. So the brain is a network of neurons, and you can track the activity of single neurons by poking them with electrodes and things like that. You can also study the activity of single molecules. So there's huge amount of data about brain at various levels of various scales. Right, we have a lot of data about sensory perception. So what happens when you give a sensory stimulus? How does it information flow through various pathways and reach the brain? So Somaji talked about the fear response. When you see a snake, you have a fear response, and so what part of the brain is involved in that? Like an organ like amygdala is primarily involved in that. So, when you look at a tree, how does information is responded to by the visual cortex in the brain, things like that. But one main question we'll all be interested in is the sense of me, the sense of self. How does the brain create it? So that's where the things get very different. It's not that we don't know anything. There's a lot of interesting work done even on this question, because we want to understand diseases like schizophrenia, which are personality disorders, where there is a deep aberrations of the sense of self or a sense of doership. Now even in there, a lot of progress has been made. But so this is one of the frontiers of the field, right? Because this is one of the toughest questions. So the question is, this is a big mystery. Like, what is this? Where is this me coming from? How does brain construct this sense of me? So let us talk about me, but let's start with something very fundamental. We all know this is blue, right? We all agree on that. But the point is your blue same as my blue? And apparently it is not. There was a big controversy about this just recently. So people were shown this middle figure, this dress, and asked what is the color of this dress. And half the people said, the internet was split on this. When these pictures went viral, and internet. Half people said this color is white and this is gold, and other sections said this color is blue and this is black. Okay, so why is this happening? Apparently, it's because so we have what is called the daylight bias. Because daylight is all the time it's there, as a background to all that we perceive visually. So daylight, if you look at the background color of the daylight, in the morning or in the evenings it is like a orange or gold. In the midday it is like blue and white. So you always try to remove that background bias. So depending upon what kind of bias you choose, you remove that bias and you kind of tend towards this option or this option. So people kept arguing about what is the correct thing. So even in something as simple as color perception, right, there is so much of controversy. So the problem is the consciousness question is basically private question. You cannot invoke this kind of a private aspect of consciousness and do research on consciousness. So that becomes a fundamental problem, because in science you cannot have anything subjective. Right, you have to talk in only terms of objective things. When we talk about consciousness from a purely medical or in a biological context, there are many different levels of consciousness. Right, like for example, you have a healthy adult, waking state, there is a certain level of consciousness, or a dead human. We consider that the person to be not conscious, or a human in coma or deep sleep or vegetative states. Or just when you get up, you're still lost and you don't know your bearings, right? And that's also conscious, but not as conscious as a waking human. And also monkeys, like primates, are onto intelligent. They show intelligent behavior, and they can learn to count. They can learn sign language. They can teach. One primate can teach sign language to another primate, and so on. But do we give them the status of consciousness? How do we even answer these questions in a satisfactory fashion? All right. So if you look at the history of, I'm talking about from Western tradition because I'm talking from scientific point of view. If you look at Descartes, right, the French philosopher Descartes, and his kind of chelas, his disciples. So they talked about mind-body problem in this fashion. So Descartes used to say that mind and body are two different substances, like mind and matter. So mind is a substance that has no spatial extension, but it is capable of thought. Matter has spatial extension, but it is incapable of thinking. And in a human being, right, these two come together magically somehow, right? And the question is, how do they come together? And that's the so-called mind-body problem. How does mind make contact with matter and influence matter? So his answer is there is a special structure in the brain called the pineal gland, and that's where this meeting, this kind of marriage of mind and body happens. And how is it even possible, even if it is pineal gland? There the answer is that this is like a trump card of philosophy, at least Western philosophy, like God, right? Because this interaction is presided by God, right? Somehow it magically happens, and I think it's rubbish. But anyway, this is the kind of thing that went on. So then William James, American psychologist from the late 19th century, he said that consciousness basically is a selection agency. It selects among multiple possibilities of thoughts. So, but with the beginning of 20th century and hardcore materialism has taken over in neuroscience, and so the schools of thought like behaviorism became quite prominent. So in behaviorism, forget about thoughts and feelings and all that. They have no place in behaviorism. The brain itself is treated like a black box. The only thing, we didn't know much about what's happening in the brain in the early 20th century. So you can think of the brain as a black box, and only thing that you can say is you present stimuli to the brain through the senses, and you look at the responses of the body, right? Hopefully brain is driving those responses, but beyond that you don't want to speculate about what's happening in the brain. So this kind of a black box thinking was very popular, and that was the basis of this behaviorism. But later on in the middle of 20th century, when computers started becoming popular, because people were using computing power in a big way to wage the Second World War, right? And so the power of computing and the theory of computation becoming popular at that time. So that led to what is called the cognitivist revolution. So where they try to describe mental process using some kind of algorithms. So when you look at some image, then first thing that you do is clean up the image, improve contrast, and then what you do is you pick up the outlines of the objects. It's called edge detection, and then you kind of fill the edges and edge completion. So they thought that perception happens according to some kind of a stage-wise algorithm. So those kinds of approaches led to what is called the cognitivist revolution. Then came the AI in the 60s and 70s, and now we see the full-blown version of AI. So all this while, I mean, the consciousness was not even attempted. The question was not even really asked, because we talked behaviorism, cognitivism, AI. In all this, there is no real serious attempt to answer the question of consciousness. Because in AI, if you look at some of the founding fathers of AI, like Marvin Minsky, he was straight materialism. There is no question of consciousness. It's an illusion. Free will is an illusion, right? And so humans are just a complex machine because brain is so complex, and so on and so forth. Okay, so but then is it just that, or because I think you cannot replace one opinion with another, right? You need to somehow do an experiment. So because that's where science, that's I think saving grace for science. You depend ultimately on experiment. So if you look at some of the oldest experiments on neuroscience in the area of consciousness, Wilder Penfield is a Canadian neurosurgeon. He did some pioneering surgeries during early part of 20th century. He did these famous neural stimulation experiments where they would expose the brain for various reasons. I don't want to go into that. But you stimulate the brain using electrically, and then see what happens. What does the subject report? Interestingly, in these experiments, these surgeries, right, the subject is awake because there is no pain in the brain. So if you anesthetize the surrounding part of the brain, when you open the brain, expose the brain, then there is no pain when actually you stimulate the brain. So in the experiments, when you stimulated a part of the brain called the visual cortex, the subject was reporting seeing lights. So point is, there is no visual stimulus presented to the subject. He is only getting stimulated in his visual cortex. Subjects report seeing light, flashes of light. Similarly, if you stimulate the auditory cortex in the brain electrically, subject reports hearing sounds. Or if you stimulate the somatosensory cortex, the subject feels that somebody is touching him. Right. So that what that means is like, you don't need a world to have sensory experiences. You just need to stimulate the brain appropriately and you have sensory experiences. That's actually a very startling conclusion. I mean, you can look at all the implications. It can be, these are explored these days in science fiction and some of these AI type TV serials, and looking at very dark kind of scenarios. But this has roots in very old experiments. Similarly, you can also shoot magnetic pulses at the brain and produce sensory experiences. Now take this very simple example. You might have seen it, in Facebook, and so if you look at this picture for about 20 seconds, turn your attention to some white background, then suddenly you will see a negative of this picture. It happens to be the picture of Jesus Christ, right? So what that shows is, when I'm looking at that image, what is called the after image, there's nothing there on the wall. I'm still seeing something. So that what you're saying is like a remnant of the activity produced by the original stimulus. So whatever is there in the brain is what you are experiencing. You don't need anything outside. So which is again confirmed by that. Similarly here, if you stare at the green bird for some time and then shift your attention to the cage, you will see an after image of the green bird. The after image is not green, it will be magenta in color, because magenta is a complementary color to the green. Similarly, if you look at the red bird for some time and shift your attention to the cage, you will see another bird in the cage, but it won't be a red bird, it will be a cyan bird, light bluish colored. So because when in the after image it gets flipped, you see a negative of the original stimulus, and when it comes to color, right, you see the complementary color. So again, you see that you don't need the world, you only experience what's happening inside the brain. Very simple experiment you can do in your home, is the experiments with blind spot. So in this case, you close your left eye and fixate the star on the left, right, and keep looking at this star, and then keep adjusting your distance to the monitor until at some point this black spot disappears. That happens because there is a part of the retina where there is no sensors. So if stimulus falls on that, you don't experience it. So that's called what is called a blind spot. So if you fixate on this cross and make sure this black spot falls on your blind spot, then what happens is, so actually blind spot doesn't mean the input there is dark. There is no input. There's no experience happening in that part. So then after some time, what you see is like this green starts filling up inside this black spot. Alright, that means there is no information coming from there. So brain likes to interpolate and fill up where there's missing information. In fact, you can say brain is a big bluff master. Whenever there's no information, it makes up things. Making up things is a very, very nature of the brain, or you can say mind. So Professor Ramachandran, Indian origin neuroscientist who is based in UC San Diego, has done a lot of work on this blind spot. He's also worked on the phenomenon called scotoma. So in these cases, there is a small lesion in the visual cortex. That means visual cortex, which processes visual information, right, that part of tissue is damaged, so it cannot process image coming to that part of the brain. So if the original image is like that, when you focus your scotoma on the image, you will see it something like this. Actually, it's not dark, it is just there's nothing there. There's no information there. But sometimes what happens is that since there's nothing there, brain likes to fill up that information. It fills up in very strange ways, and there's a lot of series of experiments done by Ramchandran and his colleagues about that. So that gives an insight into a very interesting phenomenon called blind sight. So normally we think that when you look at something, the information goes to the brain and become conscious of it visually. But there are patients or subjects where they're clinically blind. They don't see anything. They're blind, but very often they can perform visually dependent performance. So if you throw a ball at them, you might be able to catch the ball with very high accuracy. So in this case, it's just a cartoon. The guy is saying, okay, what do you see? This guy says, no, I can't see anything, like I'm blind, But then he says, why don't you take a guess? He says there are horizontal red stripes, which is actually correct. So I've actually seen reports of this kind of a thing from a doctor in one of this Sparsy Society of Tamil Nadu. So if you are not aware, how are you able to perceive, how are you able to produce responses that depend upon visual perception? So these kind of experiments separate, right, visually related performance and visual awareness, the two are separate. And so why does it happen? So very often when people have this kind of in blind spot subjects, the damage is in the visual cortex, which is a part of the cortical area, large surface of a large sheet of neurons called the cortex. But there are the visual input, when it goes to the eyes, it also goes to some inner circuits, so shorter loops. One of those loops goes to a part called superior colliculus. Another loop goes to another part called thalamus. So the thing is, information goes to the inner loop and can still become manifest as behavior. Looks like for awareness, it has to go through this huge long route going through the cortex. Only then you become aware. But if it goes to the inner loop, you can still produce behavior which is reliable, some fairly reliable, but you're not aware. So that means that shows you the conditions in the brain that are required to produce awareness, sensory awareness. So these are kinds of things that people are doing in this area. So the example is binocular vision. So we know that we have two eyes, and each eye looks at a different view of the world, and you somehow integrate the two to get a 3D perception. Now what people have shown is normally these two images are not identical but very similar with a slight shift between themselves. People have created special devices by which you can show very different images to two eyes. So for example, you show this image to one eye, this image to other eye. Then they won't be able to fuse them to construct a 3D picture. But what do they see? Okay, so do they see both simultaneously, or what happens? So it turned out when they show these kind of pictures, the two eyes are now in a conflict. It is called binocular rivalry. Right, so the brain is confused. What do I see now? The red stripes like this or the blue stripes like this? So what actually subject perceives, if they see only red for some time, right, suddenly switches to only blue for some time and only red for some time. Okay, this rivalry is sorted out by the brain in this strange fashion. Okay, and in fact, so now the question is it something that the subject feels, or is there actually brain activity that corresponds to this? The answer is they put the person through in a scanner, an fMRI, where you can image the brain, and they found that the brain's activity is also looking like this. Okay, so the kind of experience the person is feeling and the activity that you observe in the brain, they're matching in this case. So similarly, look at the interesting experiments done in the area of touch. So touch has two aspects to it. What you touch with your skin, that is one thing. Second, that is when you touch outside objects, you use skin. But you can also have a touch experience of the body, of your own internal parts, right, your joints. So you've got the sensors inside the joints. That is called proprioception, the sense of feeling of the body. Okay, so now this person, Paul Bacchi-Rita, has done very interesting experiments in what is called sensory substitution. You can substitute one sense for the other. Okay, so how does it work in this experiment? This person is blind, right? But you show some stimulus and convert the stimulus into a sensory. This is a visual stimulus of like a pattern X. You convert it into a touch stimulus and put a bunch of vibrators on the back of the person and give a pattern of vibration which looks like a visual stimulus. So after some exposure to those kinds of, so they are experiencing vision as touch. Right, this is good for blind people. After some stimulus, they started feeling as if it is vision. Okay, and so Daniel Dennett, who's written a remarkable book called I think Consciousness Unchained or Consciousness Explained, something like that. Okay, so in that book he explains that awareness is difficult sometimes to distinguish into vision or tactile or touch. Because when the awareness is very weak, it seems like something in between. You cannot put a label that it is touch or vision. It is just awareness. And so intensity so it all probably depends upon increased intensity or certain nuances that will distinguish one kind of sense from other kind of sense. So when you hear these kinds of views coming out of hardcore neuroscience experiments, you see echoes of. I mean, I'm not a expert on Vedanta or anything. You see echoes of this idea has fascinated me a lot. That is, you have this idea of Panchabhutas, right, in Indian tradition. So the Agni, Vayu, and all that. Now, Panchabhuta thing is, first of all, they're supposed to be elements, the fundamental principles of all matter. But point is, if you look at it, take it literally, none of these things are elemental. They're very composite entities. Fire is very composite. Earth is very composite. Maybe you should take it as phases, but then still that is not also not quite satisfactory. But what is interesting in Indian tradition is that they make a simple correspondence between these Panchabhutas and the Indriyas. From a scientific point of view, it's observed. I mean, how do you even make that connection? But is there a deeper principle that we are missing, that maybe we need a whole different version of physics, right, based on a kind of a renewed or a more enlightened version of Panchabhuta theory, where you will see a connection between the senses, 5 senses, and the 5 principles of the matter. Okay, I'll leave it at that, just a speculation, just an idea. Now, the question of neural substrates of consciousness, that is, when you become conscious of something, right, like I said, there are two different things. Brain's activity and consciousness, they are slightly different. You can have activity in the brain of which you are not conscious, you can have activity in the brain of which you are conscious. So, what is the kind of activity in the brain that will make you conscious? Okay, that's a question of neural substrates of consciousness. Let us see that. So, first of all, when you present a stimulus, right, let's say I show a flash of blue, and for you to become aware of it, let us say I show some yellow patch for some time, then show blue and then red. But blue comes for a very brief period between yellow and red. If it is too brief, and if you ask, like, have you seen the blue? You won't have seen it, you won't have become aware of it because it's too brief. So you need to present the stimulus for sufficiently long time for you to become aware of it. That's the first thing. There's a kind of temporal requirement that has to be satisfied. Secondly, when you become aware of that stimulus, one thing people have found repeatedly is that in the brain you will see dynamics of neural activity which is firing at a very high frequency. What is called the gamma range of 25 hertz and 1 to 145 hertz. So, and then you will find synchronized activity over large areas of the brain when a person becomes aware. So that seems to be one interesting neural substrate for consciousness. Okay, and so then the interesting experiments by a person called Benjamin Libet. So what he found is, so look at these two alternative options or conditions. So you can expose the brain. Let's say if you activate the somatosensory touch area of the brain, you feel sense of touch. We already said that. But thing is, when you stimulate the brain, you have to stimulate it for a minimum period for the sensory percept to take place. People have to stimulate at least for about half a second, which is a long period, right, for the sensory experience to take place. But when you touch a person through the normal route, this is touching a person through a very strange route, right, very unnatural route. If you touch a person through the normal route of touching a finger or something, and then that activity goes to the brain very quickly, and then when you ask them to report exactly at what time have you become conscious of it. Now that's a weak part of the whole methodology, because when do you say I become conscious of something, right? So further what they do is they have a very interesting kind of a dial on which a dot goes round and round, and you tell me, okay, have you seen it? Okay, at that point where is the dot on this dial? So you report that, and later on they'll check, because you need to have very high resolution, so to be able to time this kind of subjective conscious events. So they do that. So very interesting thing is found when you are stimulating the brain directly, right, and you ask when it happened. So the stimulation started here, you become aware of it after about half a second. But when you touch the body from outside, right, you expect that half a second delay in this case also. But in this case, the people report very quickly. How come? Now that looks very strange. So what Libet says is, since the way the brain is set up, the nervous pathways are set up, there is always that half a second delay. The subjective self does what is called subjective referral backwards in time. So I know that there is always this delay, so I may as well always subtract that time and say that, like. I'm not very satisfied with this explanation. It's as though there is a different time going on in the subjective self, but anyway, that's the kind of theory that is available. Now, so thing is, okay, let us look at the output side, perception side. Let's look at the motor output side. So generally, in output you have sensory input, and then something happens in the brain, you produce a motor output. Now between sensory input and motor output, you expect consciousness to step in, or free will to step in and modify or choose among your actions, things like that. But does it always happen? Right? There are certain patients where this doesn't happen. There's no screening between this input and the output. I mean, some people just it's called the foot in the mouth kind of syndrome, something like that. So there's this patient studied by Francois Hermite, these people are complete slaves of the sensory world. There is no conscious intervention to stop or screen your responses. For example, if they see a bed, they'll go and lie down on it. They see a toothbrush, they'll start brushing. They see a comb, they'll immediately start combing. I mean, there's no distinction whether to do or not to do. That's the whole power of free will. That's a sign of free will. These people don't have it. They're completely at the mercy of the external world. So in these people, people found that there is a part of the brain called prefrontal cortex. This is highest center in the brain, where if there is this thing called consciousness acting on the brain somewhere, if you are looking for a kind of a footprint of consciousness, right, or a kind of a launch pad or a runway for consciousness, right, that must be prefrontal cortex. So if you look at some of the main motor cortical areas of the brain, you have supplementary motor area here, and then premotor cortex here and primary motor cortex here. Now, depending upon what kind of movement you are producing, suppose you are catching a ball, you are responding to input, right? That goes through premotor and then goes to primary motor. But if you on your own, if you are like lifting your hand, Heil Hitler or something like that, right? That happens. That is initiated from supplementary motor area. So these two kind of responses are different, are done differently by the brain. It's a very interesting experiment done by Gray Walter. In this experiment, the subjects were going through some treatment. So there's an electrode sitting inside the premotor area, and then so they were asked to press this button, and when you press the button, there is a slide changer, and there's some slide is shifted, or slide is moved. But actually, unknown to them, so what happens? What's happening is the signal is picked up from supplementary motor area, and that signal directly goes to a machine which will change slide by itself. So they were told to press the button, and they will say, okay, this will shift, but actually this is what is happening in the background. So what they actually perceive when they keep doing it is, they were able to press the buttons, the slide already changes. It is as though the machine, the slide thing has a life of its own. It kind of is able to read your mind, right? It seems to be bestowed with precognition. Right? It knows your mind and is able to do it. So because normally what you would think is the intention comes first, the will, the sankalpa, right? I want to move, and then brain's activity starts in response to the sankalpa, and then the information goes to the body and your hand moves. But that's not the case. The activity starts first in SMA, supplementary motor area, that goes to the machine directly, quickly, right? And then that moves the slide, and then slowly it builds up in the brain, and then you become aware after that, right? And then you move your hand, and by the time this fellow has already understood what you are trying to do, and it's moved the machine. So what is happening in this case is, so similar things have been done by Benjamin Libet also. So the normal intuitive explanation into sequence that you will imagine is willed action first, right, and then motor activity in the brain, electrical activity in the brain, and then movement. But actually what people have found is motor activity in the brain, then the sense of sankalpa or will, the subjective sense, and then movement. So which kind of completely robs you of your dignity and honor as an individual self and doer and so on and so forth. What is the brain initiates an action all by itself. It doesn't even need your consult you. It doesn't need your permission, and just courteous enough to inform us by the way about the proceedings that were initiated right under the nose of the conscious self. If this is how it's going to be, where is sense of responsibility? How do you put the Nirbhaya criminals, to this thing, to how do you hang them? This can say, oh, it's my SMA doing all this, right? So these are at least very fundamental philosophical questions, in many domains of human society. So the problem now in the whole question of consciousness in neurosciences, there are two worlds: the subjective world, we call it the C, and the objective world of C prime. What is the correspondence between these two? It's not a simple one-to-one correspondence, right? So how do you work out this subtle and complex relationship between the external world and the internal world? So there are also people talking about EM field theory, electromagnetic field theories of consciousness, that somehow it's the electromagnetic field of the brain that is producing the consciousness and so on. Interestingly, I've read a similar idea in Sri Aurobindo's commentary on Isha Upanishad. He says that prana is a mediator between mind and body, that prana is a carrier. Whatever is happening in the mind, it brings into the world, right, and influences the matter. Okay, and so EM field is not mind itself, but it is something that carries influence of the mind into the body, into the brain, which is matter. Okay, so but whatever it is, I think as the theories of consciousness unfold in neuroscience, they might force a very deep revision of physical theories. Otherwise, it doesn't make much sense. Otherwise, it will be like two different compartments, and each person or each community is saying its own thing without any connection. But I think sooner or later it will revise your notions of time and space, and you cannot say it's all subjective time, it's all subjective space, and so on. you will have to work out fundamental relationship between the so-called subjective time, subjective space, and subjective percepts and the objective world. Okay, thank you.
Just I will tell a brief thing. So I thank both the speakers for this wonderful discourse and explanation about the question of consciousness and deeper understanding of life. Especially Tyagi Maharaj spoke about so many different varieties of defect that may happen in the different way of epistemology that we know. And Sir has very nicely given the explanation about how modern science is trying to understand consciousness from the brain point of view. I have a brief comment on what you both spoke, especially about what about the plants? Do you think they are conscious or not? What about bacteria? Do you think they are sentient entities or not? Because there are very interesting papers that are being published. One paper I can refer to you, Bacteria are Small but Not Stupid, by James Shapiro. He is a biologist in University of Chicago, and there is a scientist called Mancuso. You might be knowing his name, and he has lot of works on plant intelligence, plant behavioral aspect, plant signaling. You can read lot of works. There are journals on that. And also about Tyagi Maharaj, he has given very nice explanation about Gaudiya Vaishnava perspective, and also the scientific aspect, how they can come together and work harmoniously instead of diversing and conflicting with each other, because both trying to understand the reality. So I open it to the audience. Now first Dr. Garg wanted to ask something. Please, sir.
Yeah, this is regarding neuroscience, and quick comment and then a question about your cortical stimulation and producing sensations. So the seat is there. So in support of that, being a radiologist, I can tell you, because I do functional MR imaging, you can have a mismatch. For example, if the nerves get they get disconnected and then get wrongly connected, one particular sensory modality can be seen as another, and it works the other way around also. I mean, as a motor activity. For example, the Frey syndrome in auricular temporal nerve, after surgery for the parotid gland. So when you eat, you start sweating. So there is a mismatch, wrong connection of the fibers. So the CT is in fact there. One sensory input can be perceived something as something else. Yeah. So it is just a nerve electrical impulse that goes. So the sensation is different. So that supports your point. Yeah. And about your particular subject, one question is regarding computational neurobiology, neuroscience. So like Penrose devised the Penrose tiles. So his claim is that it is mathematical, but it's not computational, because Penrose tile can be laid down, supposing this floor has to be tiled. A lay person, anybody can tile the floor with those tiles. But because the pattern is aperiodic, it doesn't repeat, so you cannot write an algorithm for it. So that hits at the core of computational neuroscience. And second, after Gödel's incompleteness theorem, just one question was that. And second is about Gödel's incompleteness theorem and how it impinges upon your field.
So what is the question? You are making comments. I don't see any question.
No, the first question is that Penrose claims that this is not computational. It is mathematical, the thinking in the brain, but it's not computational. He put forward
Shadows of the Mind.
Shadows of the Mind, yeah.
I didn't understand a thing about that book. I mean, he talks about quantum gravity, way above my knowledge of physics. I'm sorry.
No, I am not talking about the collapse of the wave function. I'm just talking about the basic thing that he has shown that there are aperiodic things. So human mind can do that, whereas a computer will not be able to do it because the pattern does not repeat. You cannot write an algorithm for it.
Yeah, so like I said, I have no idea. I tried to read that book, right. I just couldn't go through it.
Okay, fine, thanks.
One question, a very simple question to both of them. After hearing both of you, my question is, are we pawns in a larger game?
Sorry, are we?
Are we pawns in a larger game? P-A-W-N-S. Are we pawns in a larger game? Because from what you say, Srini, I was really confused what's happening in me now. Okay, and from your presentation, I'm really confused between Shastra and science now, obviously. That means there's something going beyond Shastra and science. That question is arising in my mind. Okay, that's my question.
Right, no,
First, I'll say I just want to apologize for my presentation going over time. I'd really lost track of time, so pardon me for that. Are we pawns in a larger game? I'm going to speak from the basis of Shastra and say definitely. But there is nothing beyond Shastra. Shastra is the ultimate authority by which absolute reality is known, and according to Shastra, we're pawns in a larger game.
Yes, Dr. Alok. Yeah, please. No, after him. Yeah, let Alok.
Good morning and very welcome. I am Dr. Patra from SRM University and from Calcutta actually, originally. My question to Tyagi Maharaj first. In his course he has said that self is, as per Shastra, is non-material, non-perceivable. In Vedanta, as far I can slowly remember, Srinantu Visya Amrita Putra means the sages, Indian sages are starting the Vedanta as we have perceived, we have realized, and you come and realize with us, with the method what we are describing. First, this is my question. Second is the...
Can we go one by one?
One by one, yeah.
Yeah. So, like science, Shastra intends to be a replicable system of knowledge. In other words, it's an organized system of thought that another unrelated person, upon being properly trained, will reach the same ultimate perception or experience of reality that the person who devised the system described. As in a science experiment, one professor conducts an experiment, he describes all the variables, how they're controlled, and another can reproduce the same results. So, by following precisely the method prescribed in Shastra, one can have perception of the reality and existence of the Atma, or the Self. However, the means by which that will be perceived is not naturalistic or related to the scope by which things can be known in science. It's related to a means of perception that's revealed by that spiritual reality itself through Shastra.
Next question.
Can be brief. Okay?
Yeah, next question to Sir. That is when about the consciousness.
About consciousness.
About consciousness. When we conceive something, or when we perceive something, or when we realize something. Suppose eye is seeing something, brain is seeing other things. Who actually look on the object?
Sorry, I
He's
didn't.
saying that I am actually trying to see something, but brain is inattentive. So who is actually seeing things?
Okay, so what neuroscience can tell you is when you are seeing means, so we'll try to talk in objective terms, things that you can measure and describe. So we can trace how the light falls on the retina and how it's converted into electrical signals and how it goes to thalamus and then visual cortex and all that we can describe. But when you say who is seeing it, it's outside the scope of neuroscience. We can talk about attention. So for example, when you're attending, so I think Swamiji talked about attention. Attending, there's also neural subset to attention. So when you're looking at one part and not paying attention to another, the part we are looking at, the activity of neurons there will be slightly higher than part that you are not attending. So attention has very concrete consequences in the brain. About 10 to 15% increase higher firing rate can be seen. So attention is very concrete. Alright, so that this much I can tell, but if when you say who, we are talking about a holistic self and those kinds of ideas. At least outside my understanding of neuroscience.
Professor Rama Brahman, will you give the mic? Be okay, just point.
I enjoyed both your talks, and one question to Sir. The definition of consciousness from Vedanta point of view and neuroscience seems to be different. I mean, they approach the world in a different way. but there are some similarities also, and the gap may be filled by brain waves, study through brain waves or anything you can say.
So I think one problem with consciousness research in neuroscience is the definition of consciousness, like you said, because the kind of Achilles heel of the whole methodology is you depend on the subject's subjective report.
It seems it is more limited.
Yeah, because there's a constraint that you cannot be subjective, but that makes it completely meaningless if you completely remove that. So we'll allow this much of subjectivity, which is you just say what you're feeling, what you're seeing. That's still subjective, but without that, no. Yeah, so you have to only do work within that framework, which becomes a serious limitation.
Yes.
So it's a kind of, it can be seen as to be slightly
For me, it
confused.
appears both are different. I mean, defined differently. That's all.
Yeah.
Defined different. Word is same, but defined differently. Yes, one sir. G. As your comparison, actually yours is a very good Samanvaya effort, where you try to synthesize or see the common factors between scientific approach and Vedanta approach. It's really very good, and I like it very much.
The last question the student wants to ask.
Good afternoon, sir. So, first of all, very nice talk of both of you. Actually, I have one question. Yeah, I am Rishabh Samra. I am a research scholar, MS scholar here in Electrical and Computer Science Department. So, sir, this is my question in the intersection of science and spirituality. Basically, I am trying to investigate the learning mechanism that occurs in an infant. How exactly an infant learns. Basically, it is found that infant with limited information from the environment generalizes or occurs to a phenomenon or generate explanation for some phenomenon which no one teaches them. So any scientific explanation for how exactly the learning occurs in an infant who based on limited information, or it is also found in scriptures that in womb itself infant starts reasoning, the process of reasoning starts itself. And is there any knowledge transfer from external source, any scientific evidence that in scriptures it is found that knowledge transfer occurs? Any scientific explanation for such phenomena?
Yeah, so I can give a couple of examples one example to support that. So learning in a neuroscience sense does begin in fetus level. So for example, if you look at visual system, development of visual system, so you need the external stimulus, visual stimulus to normally train the brain. But so in the fetal stage, obviously fetus is in a dark womb, right? There's no visual stimulus. So eyes generate spontaneous activity called retinal waves, which goes to the brain and starts shaping the maps in the visual cortex right at that stage. But the kind of things you are referring to is Prahlada learning from Narada, and that we don't know. Abhimanyu and also Prahlada learning from Narada, right? Yeah, so those kinds of things we don't know, but there is evidence for that. But even
at neuronal level, the phenomenon occurs.
Fetal level, yeah, phenomenon occurs, yeah.
Okay.
Anything you want to comment on this?
I mean, I can say from a Shastric perspective that in the elements of perception that I described, the jiva is in a subtle sheath comprised of a chitta, ahankar, buddhi, manas, and that this travels with the jiva from birth to birth. So an infant is carrying the subconscious impressions of innumerable previous lives within it already, and as it develops in its perception and linguistic skills in this present life, more and more of those stored perceptions start getting signaled, matched, and it frames a directly non-subconscious or an actively conscious bank of knowledge about the world.
Sir, one more question. Sir,
we can have a discussion after the end because everybody needs some time.
Sir, regarding this consciousness, and you were showing many experiments about Libet. So one thing is there.
Speak to the mic.
So one thing is there that in the Vedantic philosophy it is mentioned that when somebody is sleeping, and suppose that is a dreamless sleep, and when he awakens from that sleep, two things are there. The sensory apparatus is not active. That is a Vedantic, understanding. But still, when he awakens, he has two awareness. First thing is that he has had a sleep, And second thing is that some time has passed.
Yeah.
So, as far as knowledge is concerned, even though the senses are not working here, but there is knowledge still.
There is?
Still knowledge.
Yeah.
And other thing is that even Socrates actually mentioned that point. He distinguished between sensuous thought and pure thought, that is contemplative thought. That means there is a thought world which is not controlled by it is not necessary to have a sensory input. And even Penfield, he was quoted by George Wald actually, who was also Nobel laureate. And Penfield was mapping the brain with the different responses. But in the end, in his book he wrote, the consciousness does not arise, it is not in the cortex.
Not in the cortex. No.
It is not arising from the cortex, but it is there somehow, in some shape. So do you think this type of explanations can be utilized to better explain the results, like what you are getting in response time, all these things, lapse?
Thank you. It's a difficult question. I'll try to see what I can. So first of all, you said in deep sleep the senses are not active. That's what you said. Yeah. Yeah. So senses, sensory organs are not active because your eyes are closed or whatever. But the parts of the brain which normally respond to sensory input, they are active, even in deep sleep. So in fact, if you look at the knowledge transfer, right, during waking state, you gather knowledge from the world to the senses, which stays for a short while in hippocampus, which is like a short-term memory store. During dream sleep, it is pulled up again, right, and seems to screen those memories, sift them out on the basis of probably importance, or I don't know what's the basis, but it seems pull up, and because that's why in your dreams you often see kind of a mixtures of weird mixtures of what you have experienced in the waking time. So there's a hippocampus and cortex together pulling up. In deep sleep, whatever is sifted by hippocampus is now passed on to the cortex for long-term storage. There's a lot of evidence for all this. That means that cannot happen without those corresponding brain areas becoming active.
I think we can have the discussion after that because we're getting late for the lunch. So Sandeep Mishra is the last comment, and then
So
announcement for the lunch.
So I just want one final thing. So about the difference between science and spirituality, right? I think one saving grace I see for science is when you have a doubt, you do an experiment. Let the experiment speak for itself. In spirituality, when you have a doubt, you look up a book, the Shastra, the text. But text is a fixed thing. No, I'm just saying. Unless the Shastra is constantly a fresh experience.
No, not only that, actually there may be conflict. There may be conflict among scriptures also. That's why it is told in Bhagavatam, Mahajana Janagata Pantha. Not that you understand by reading and another person understand another kind of meaning and another person understand. There is an authoritative way of receiving that knowledge. There is a very little subject. But we can leave it to that for this event. And I think
so. I just wanted to bring out a point that there are some animals who can sleep with eyes open. So that means that they are fishes. So that means that they are able to process some sensory information to protect their own life. So if there is some danger, it's only human beings who close off all their senses, so to say. Though they do not close off completely. I mean, ears are open, other things, nose are open. If you have many times, you will imagine yourself, if you have some very bad kind of sound, you will wake up. So if your senses were totally off, then why would you wake up? You don't hear anything. So it's not true that in sleep you are not hearing. Only thing is you are not paying attention, so it is not gamma entangled. So that means you are not paying attention, but the things are coming and sometimes you may do it. The reason why humans are able to shut down that is because they can then in sleep process their information, as he was saying.
Simple comment. I must introduce Professor Sandeep Mishra is a cardiologist from AIIMS New Delhi.
But the simple idea that in sleep.
He wanted to say something.
Let him answer the question.
No, one comment to add to that point. So, for example, how many times do you fall off the bed when you are sleeping? Never, almost never, unless you are a small baby. That means brain is tracking your rolling movements and constantly keeping you. I mean, although you are asleep. So that shows the sensory system fully in charge, like running the show. Okay.
Okay.
You can introduce first yourself.
Okay, sir. Sir, I am a doctor. I am a professor, a retired professor from Puri Ayurvedic College. So since long I am associated with Sant Maharaj and Muni Maharaj. When he is calling, we are standing behind him. Okay. So as regards sir and that discussions, what is my suggestions? So there are the lines. Aptaha Jatharthavadino. Aptaha means who, according to his name. Apta means the two type of apta. One is pustaka, books, another is guru, teachers. So if you are in doubt after pratyaksha anuman and upadesha, then you have to go to the teacher. School of thoughts and thoughts. So here physics, Professor Ganesan is there, department is there. You have to ask him. He is the right man, he can lead you. And another, your father, your traditional knowledge. Two type of knowledge we got from the, one is family tradition, another is school of thoughts. So aptaha, jathartha bhajan, they called it aptapadesha means, aptaha means teachers. Thank you.
So I think we want to say last brief comment from Maharaj and then we announce for the lunch. About Apta, you talked about his...
No, I'm done. He was going to class at 2 o'clock. I have class at 2 o'clock.
Yeah. So you want to say something or? Okay. I think Professor Ganesh wants to make an announcement.
Just an announcement. Before the announcement, a little humor. Patra sir, you were talking about the seeing, no? I can tell you how many times have you seen students looking at you? Actually, they are looking through you, okay? Thank you very much. Okay, fine. So lunch is in the mini hall. So please do join us for lunch, okay? And Srini, meet you later. Sir, please join. I think it's already, we're running behind by almost 45 minutes plus, okay? So we'll try to get back by 2:30 at least, okay? Yes, sure.